Hi, guys. We are gathered here today to discuss the movie I Am Not Your Negro. And I think that one thing that we could do before we get started is just kind of introduce ourselves. I'm sure, well, I guess we could just acknowledge that we're all library employees so that all, however many of us don't have to repeat that line. But if we could all just say our names so that people who ultimately are watching this kind of feel like we're actual people with actual names. I'm Sherlanya. Who's next?
I'm Jackie.
I'm Nancy.
I'm Jacob.
Oh, I'm Lucy.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Rich.
All right. So this movie is kind of an interesting one to sort of jump into, right? So this movie came out in 2016, and it was sort of based on a unfinished project that James Baldwin had called Remember This House. And it was to be a personal account of the rise and fall of other individuals who were involved in the civil rights movement, men who were his friends who had all been killed because of their work in the civil rights movement: Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Medgar Evers. So that's sort of, I just like to take a moment, sort of drop us back in to what it is that we're discussing. But the first question that I kind of want to jump into solely for my own curiosity is, what was your experience watching this film like? For me, I know that I had 1,000 feelings while I was watching this film, which is a little bit unusual to me when I am watching documentary, right? And so I was really curious about how you experienced this.
For me, I think I watched this about right when I actually got it from the library. Maybe about 6 months after it came out. And so it's been a little while since I've seen it, but I did go back and watch parts of it to refresh my memory. But I remember really vividly, the first thought was, why the heck don't we teach this in schools? Because this was not James Baldwin's perspective on the civil rights movement was so much more intimate and all-encompassing than anything that I had experienced learning outside of school or in school about the civil rights movement. And that was really refreshing, and at the same time, really poignant, and really, I had 1,000 feels. I had 1,000 feelings as I was watching it too, of just, because civil rights is, as at the time, was so multifaceted and is so multifaceted now. I had a really hard time identifying what I felt and kind of parsing it all out. But at the same time, it was an easy experience to really just fall into. I'm really difficult with documentaries. I don't oftentimes really like sink into them. A lot of times it's something that I have on in the background and I'm doing something else. But this one really sucked me in and was absolutely fascinating and enlightening, and just a really great experience as far as a documentary goes, and taught me a lot of things that I didn't know. And that was great for me, because it was a springboard into a lot of other reading and films and documentaries and stuff that I watched subsequently after that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Agree with what you and Nancy are both saying about like the experiencing so many different feelings watching this. And I think that part of what makes it such a powerful and engaging documentary is that it's like the words of James Baldwin, which are, he just has a gift with words, and then it's put so carefully to different images from the time period that he was in, when, like, I think some of it probably even comes from, I know they made a movie when he took these travels down south, but then putting it with like footage from, even Ferguson, or then the civil rights movement during James Baldwin's time. I just think that it was very intimate in that way. There was no narrator sort of telling us. It was all James Baldwin's words, and then these images that the director had carefully curated to go with them. And so I just think that it was extremely engaging and powerful because of that.
It was a different experience for me for those reasons as well. Just having the comparison with what we're seeing today, made it less of a history lesson and more of a, this is what we're still experiencing every day. And that's something that, although I think I knew it at an intellectual level, I didn't experience it the same way until I saw the images put next to each other.
To that point, a lot of the conversations and arguments, there's the section where he goes on the Dick Cavett show, and there's he's like a philosophy professor, I think, and asks why do we always have to talk about race? Can't we connect on other levels? And he explains pretty clearly what that difference is, and it feels like something you run into today, where people are like, why do we have to keep talking about this? And this is now 20 plus years since James Baldwin's been dead, and these are the same conversations so many years later, and then 20 years before that, like it's the same. That hitting me in different snippets of how long this has been. Like in doing some of the research, just reading some of the reviews when the documentary came out, one of the things that the New York Times A.O. Scott wrote, sorry, I wrote it down, was like the question of since when is everything about race? And his flippant thing was going to answer since 1619. Like, and so it's just the sheer length or the sheer, I don't know, duration of this conversation and the same things. That was really like, that hit me.
Go ahead.
I felt several moments of that too, where it's like that weight of time kind of falls on top of you a little bit. And I remember there being a couple moments, especially with the juxtaposition of photographs and video from the civil rights movement with things that were happening in Ferguson during our time. There was this sense of like devastation and hopelessness of like, why are we doing this again? Why is this? And that question is what really sprung my research into race relations in America now, was because it was the shock of like, that was the first moment where it really sunk in for me that nothing has changed, that it's, some things, very tiny things may have changed, but by and large, we're dealing with the same issues as we were 30 years ago. And that was at the same time super hopeless and at the same time very hopeful, because there's so much more to learn and so many more places that we can go. But yeah, that was heavy at the time of watching this.
Rich, one of the things that stood out to me about the part of the movie that you were making reference to, right, when the other guy was like, why does it always have to be about race? And then he went on to give other examples, and he said something like, I have more in common with an academic than somebody who is opposed to scholarship, essentially. And then he made another example. One thing that I noticed about that is the way that, even in the way that he framed these other things, it was very oppositional, right? And so like, I feel like his examples that he gave were very telling, right? Because he's like, I have more in common than someone who would be against us here, right? Which then means that he framed race as like a for and against thing. And he, Mr. Philosophy, I don't even think was present in what he was doing, right? And then I think that one of the things, when I hear people say things like that, it's like there's a different experience when you are accustomed to being framed in terms of your race and never knowing when that race anvil is going to fall on your head, Wile E. Coyote style, versus if you're socialized to feel that you're raceless, right? Because like for some of us, like you just don't know. You just do not know when you're going to be smacked in the face with like somebody's expectations that come with whatever they think about your race. And then others of us get to be like taken aback when they're confronted with their race. And I think that that's a very interesting tension that we saw in this film and that we can watch every day, right? Like everybody wants a race vacation, it seems like, but like some people are able to get it and other people are not. It's just like a silly thing to say, but
No, but it ties into a lot of the other discussions that we've had and a lot of the other resources of that concept that white people in America don't have to think about it. It's very much that. And for the discussions that I've had with the people around me, and especially in my family, is always that point of trying to explain to them why they should have to think about it. That's the hardest part for everyone in my family to really wrap their heads around, is why does it matter? And it's my examples because it matters to everybody else. So that's the hardest thing to, I think, for folks that haven't grown up and haven't been socialized into having to think about it. That's one of the core things that's hard to wrap your head around.
And not to take it from the initial question and get deep into this part, but James Baldwin, the part of what's said during the documentary is, I might mess this up, but it was the history of Black America is the history of America, and it's not good, or there was some qualifier on that's like, it's hard, and we're feeling this today, to have this kind of, like, we've got, not to get super political, but we've got a president saying that we have to be proud to be Americans, and we need to be, but that's a tinge of what that means, and to unpack how we got here, and there are problems to that, all the way back to Native Americans, to slavery, everything else. Mm-hmm. That's part of this thing. And so again, not being a James Baldwin scholar, like Baldwin talking about all of these different things as being like, there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for America to look at this stuff and to really come to terms with it in a healthy way that requires confronting it and requires work. And that was another juxtaposition, the Native America, the history of America with Native Americans and the history of America with slavery and present day with Black people is like, it was that we don't want the same things to happen. There was that where he talked about free labor, and then once we don't need that labor anymore, what happens? And there was like a moment where it was like, I never thought of it that way. So
if we talk about the free labor, though, we also have to talk about the prison system, right? Because that's where that free labor is happening now, right? And there's a direct lineage between like what happened directly following the Civil War and like how people actively went about getting that free labor, and then like all of the labor that is happening, people working for prison for pennies in correctional facilities, right? So I think it's pretty important to draw the parallels in between the two. I mean, and then in some ways, like when you look at certain sorts of policies and the way that certain rules are written, there does seem, the one way of looking at it, you definitely can see like a targeting of like that same portion or those same portions of the population, right? Those who have a lot of access to money, have a whole different situation regardless of their race than people who don't. And then like, once you put the racial coefficient on that, things fall where you would expect them to fall too, right? And so I think that one thing to think about, as this film sort of encourages us to do, is think about like the continuation of systems or levers that were switched a while ago and how they continue to play out, right? Because like the way that this film was framed, there is no finality in this film, right? There is no bow, there's no lid on the box, there's none of that. This film is not set up that way, and I do think that that's very intentional. What do you guys think about that?
I thought so too. Yeah, because I think the whole film was an ongoing conversation, and that you keyed into something that I've always been really keen on, is how social structures change over the course of time, and how especially systems of oppression, because if you think of between God, and I'm talking like back in human history, between feudal and serf systems to slavery to indentured servitude, slavery, and like all the way that that's progressed into like the prison system that we have now, and the barriers in socioeconomic class that we have in America now, and how that like I grew up learning that like systems of control means something specific. But in a larger scope, it means something different over the course of time and in different areas, because it can vary based off of geography, economic class, race, especially in America. And that's something that I don't know gets talked about a lot, of how those systems of oppression have really changed in kind of the insidious ways that white people don't think of systems as oppressive. So,
Well,
I'm kind of all over the place with that, but
no, and to echo some things that you were saying, I think a point that the film made, especially within that conversation between the Mr. Philosophy and James Baldwin, was that racist white people are so exhausted with being racist, but are not exhausted with racism. And that can be reflected and seen in how racist white people react to learning that racism is a systemic problem in this country. So that's something that the film did for me that was really powerful, something that really stuck with me. I was also, and I'm eager to see if anybody else felt the same way. The choice to colorize the photos from the 1960s and the different protests and marches, seeing those images in color, just that simple choice from the filmmakers really made me consider things differently, that it's not in the past, that the same images that I see of Ferguson are not different than the images that I look at in Birmingham, Alabama. And that really knocked me out.
I see a lot of nodding. So I'm curious about how other people felt specifically about the colorization of the images. I was taken aback by it. I was like, what am I even like? I just felt like especially if there's an image that felt somewhat familiar, like to see it suddenly like in color, it was like, what am I even looking at right now? You know what I mean? For me, it made me like stop and consider the image again. You know, like if you pulled out your wallet and like all your dollar bills were suddenly like different colors, you would stop and look at them again. Like, wait a minute, what is this I'm looking at? Right? Because like you're used to like not looking at stuff you've seen more than once. So that's how I felt. What other responses did people have to that?
I think Jacob, your point about like that it kind of made you realize that it isn't that different from today. Like it modernized something that took place in the past, but could still be taking place today. I didn't really think about that till you said that, but that is very powerful. And I think the director in general does a lot of things with images where he pairs, like he puts color in, or he'll pair like footage of Doris Day then with like a Black woman hanging from a tree. And you just realize like there are these two very different realities in this country. And I think when you see it laid out like that, that it's just, it really is a strong reminder. So I think some of the ways that the director played around with the images and the footage and the pictures really spoke to like the messages that Baldwin was trying to get apart with his words. So.
Mm-hmm. I felt the same kind of, it was almost like gut punch of reality with the colorized images versus black and white photos. And I've experienced that with other sources too. The there was a film recently done about World War I that colorized a lot of film and images from World War I. And I had the same kind of almost reality slap of like, this actually happened. It's not just an image in a textbook. And I felt the opposite thing, seeing color pictures being in black and white, where it almost, the starkness of black and white. And I've heard this from folks that do photography, that I know that there's a deliberate emotional connection for humans between black and white photography and color photography or images, and it elicits a certain emotional reaction. And I kept asking myself, why am I having that reaction? I don't really understand why it's so much more powerful for me that the images are in color, but I'm constantly asking myself that question and noticing it, of like, it is more powerful to me, and it becomes more real if it's in color.
I think that going along with what everybody's saying, and Peck's like really masterful use of color and black and white and historical images and footage and archival footage, I think that really speaks to Baldwin's own sense of how images really say a lot about a culture and what we believe. And I know that a lot of the quotations about movies that were pulled out were from his book, The Devil Finds Work. And I've read chunks of that book, but it was just kind of a different experience to see the actual footage that he's talking about while it's being narrated. And also just like these other random, film, whether it's like archival film, like news film, or these like random movies that maybe Baldwin doesn't talk about, that like, illustrate like, like what the American dream is supposed to look like, or like what happy white people are supposed to look like, and that like Baldwin was very, right, he was very attuned to like, right, what those images say about a culture at a deeper level. And so to me, like, it was, to have someone who is like so good at sort of like cutting all that footage together, like really reinforced Baldwin's kind of intelligence and sensitivity around that.
To echo what you're saying, going into this film, I really thought it was going to be like a documentary biopic about James Baldwin. That's, of course, is not really what it is. And when I started seeing these images from films, and hearing what he had to say about those films, I was like, wait, this movie, a part of one of its framing devices is popular culture, and how that affects how Americans at large perceive the American experience, specifically the Black American experience. That I guess this is all to say that I appreciated that the film had different framing devices. So perhaps if that door doesn't open for you naturally, there's another door for you to go through to get to the point.
Mm-hmm. It almost makes me ask the question of like, is there a connection between pop culture and propaganda in a certain way?
The answer to that question is yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's my personal opinion is that it's an absolute yes. But I'm willing to entertain an argument that it's not for maybe 3 seconds, and then I'm gonna know.
So I wanted to talk about, like, I'm glad that you guys brought up these images, because I wanted our discussion to kind of roll over that, right? Because, we're watching the film and then we are watching like these images that we know were like standard, regular pop cultural images. I mean, like Aunt Jemima just went away, right? So like this isn't even something that's like far, far, far in the past. You know what I mean? Like if we think about like all sorts of images, and I'm curious about like how it felt to watch that. Like, what'd you think? Because like going into the movie, if you weren't familiar with it, like Jacob, you're saying, like if you go in and you're like, okay, this is a biography about somebody whose words, we keep making Mr. Baldwin work for us over and over, and like we keep knocking at his door.
He's
So
not getting royalties beyond the grave for all the work he's going through.
right?
I hope so.
Like that dude is just
I wish.
swirling in his grave like a rotisserie chicken, man.
Yep.
Just like, oh, they called me again. But like, you're not necessarily expecting I was not necessarily expecting those particular jarringly racist pop culture images.
I wasn't either. I mean, it's something that looking at them outside of the context of the film, I understood on a subconscious level. There's something wrong with these images. There's something missing. They're telling me something that I don't necessarily believe. But seeing the way that the director juxtaposed them together and cut them together made it so crystal clear for me. This is exactly where my uncomfortability with those images is coming from. And it made so much more sense of like identifying what my gut feeling was without even having to say anything. And that is talent as far as like directing and putting images together is, because that can get really muddy really fast, but to make it so clear and have elicit such an emotional reaction from a viewer, that was really, really powerful for me. So
I mean, I think one thing that for me, the images helped me access, and the film footage helped me access, was the intersection of race and gender and sexuality. And a lot of what we're seeing is like not only like how a person of a certain race is expected to act or supposed to act, but like also like what are like gender norms and how do those play into the whole system. You know, and it's right. I mean, it's always something that like that Baldwin is like, it's always a part of what he's talking about, but it's often not like the central thing that he's talking about. But just seeing, for instance, like all the images of like, you know, idealized white femininity, and seeing that like how in fact like deadly that is, like for pretty much everybody, but like for some people more than others. You know, like there was a way that footage is kind of like really rounded out, like brought a fullness to a lot of different aspects that Baldwin is kind of touching on with his words.
And bringing up gender and sexuality, specifically sexuality, keyed into something that I read more after I watched the film. I read a lot of reviews and critiques that talked about the fact that the film didn't tie in Baldwin's sexuality as much as it was in reality, or at least that's a sense that I got, that race and sexuality for him were very closely entwined as far as his personal experiences. And I remember it being mentioned a couple times in the film that he was gay, but the reading that I did subsequently after watching the film made it clearer that it was much more closely tied than the film portrayed it. And I think that's something. Sometimes you do have to leave out a certain identity in order to fully explore one, because it can be hard. It can be easy to confuse things, and it gets quickly confused if you're trying to discuss two of them at once. But I would have loved to have more experience in that film with his sexuality and see how closely entwined that was for him. And for me, I was going to do that fully with reading his works and doing that research for myself outside of a film. But I think it would have been really interesting to see the film portray that more directly.
I am so glad that you guys are bringing this up, because I had a mental tussle, if you will. I felt like I was watching the film, and every time somebody said something, I was like, and he's gay, and James Baldwin is gay, but then I was like, why is that my reaction? That's not what that's not what the film is talking about. And it's like, although his sexuality, of course, is important in his experience as a Black man, but that's not the thing that was on the menu, if you will. And why do I need to constantly like, I think it raised questions within my heart about how I conflate the queer experience with the Black experience, or the experience of being a person of color. And I was like, I don't need both at once. I just need to listen and learn to what this movie is telling me, which might be a controversial opinion. I don't know.
No,
But I
it
definitely
makes
have an
me,
internal
oh,
struggle.
sorry.
No.
It makes me think about what Baldwin says about being a witness, and like how that is, it is difficult to be a witness. There's a fine line between being a participant and being a witness, but his role here was to be a witness. So he went back to the South to kind of look at, had the civil rights movement done anything, had it changed anything, and he was conflicted about being a witness and not always being a participant. You know, he felt like he hadn't done the hard work that other people had done by just being a witness. Then he also realized that there was an important job to be done in being a witness, because someone has to tell the story. And so maybe that, you know, I'm just hearing what you guys are saying and thinking about that, and maybe that's why that part of Baldwin, his sexuality wasn't as big of a part of this story, because he was being a witness to what the civil rights movement had done in this country or hadn't done. That just popped into my head when you guys were talking about that.
You using the word witness, that was so in thinking about how James Baldwin runs through the lives of these three men who were focal points in the civil rights movement, and how he talks about, I don't know much about his full relationship with these three, but they touch on it a little, and then they touch on how he learns about how each of them dies and his memories of being at those funerals, and then looking at the date, like looking at the date of the film begins with him writing that pitch to his publisher about the book he wants to write. So that's in 1979. And he dies in 1987, and there are what, 30 or 40 pages? Like how hard it was for him to write this, to have been there with all of these men through all these things as that witness, and to be so close to them, and doing his own, I mean, him writing is more than just, he downplays it a little. He played a big role, enough to get a thick FBI dossier on himself. And so he's just as much of a target as these three men who've each been murdered. And he puts himself out there to tell this story, to try and tell this tale that he was there for a lot of it. And yeah, I guess I had feelings about that. And then the intricacies of those relationships, how he argued with each of them about their stances, or how his opinion changed over time, or all these different things. It's just being there for all of this was remarkable, especially doing some research later. Like, wow, he knew everybody. He was part of everything. And so it's just overwhelming how much he was part of.
Jacob.
Yeah, and then
sorry.
I would say, and then he couldn't tell the story. I mean, he struggled to tell the story, which is just, you know, really speaks to how difficult being a witness was. So.
Jacob, in response to some of the things that you were talking about, right? Like when you're like, you know, and, you know, Nancy, you were talking about it too, about the fact that he was gay. It was like very like, what we hear about it once, like when they're like, and there was this FBI file or whatever. But I feel like when we think about parallels between his time and our time, that you could see a little bit of that too, right? Like some of the, you know, like when you hear people talking about Black Lives Matter, and then you hear other people saying, yeah, Black trans lives matter too, folks, right? And so there is this, like this tension also parallels, I think, right? When, and that's, you know, I joked about this or talked about this in another one of the discussions, right? Like, I feel like I see different Facebook fights than some other people, right? Like the people that I have known over my lifetime, I'm not watching people like fight about like, you know, whether or not they think that Black Lives Matter. Like that's just not in my circle. But I am watching this argument or like this happen a lot where like some people are like, well, that's not what the point is. And other people are like, that absolutely is a part of the picture, you know, and some people doing the very same thing that happens in conversations about racism, right? Where it's like, aren't we all just people, right? Like you kind of hear that same argument, aren't we? But we're all Black together, right? But like then it never gets down to acknowledging that there are people who are facing intersections of oppression differently, and then like the drill never gets down to that other piece of the you know, thing that you're putting together. So I don't think that it's unfair to raise that question, right? Because that question is daily, you know, and just like people are Black every day, people are gay every day, people are trans every day, and like these intersections are interacting on people's lives every day, you know what I mean? And like it's not fair for someone who's not having those realities to just kind of be like, let's not open door number 7, right? Because like I want to focus on door number 3 and then we'll get to door number 7 one day, right? And so I think it's a fair question, you know, and I do think that I think that one of the things that James Baldwin argues, or this film argues through James Baldwin's words, is that like, yo, people are capable of holding more than one thought in their heads at a time, even though we pretend like we cannot, right? And I think that he does this all over the place, and I think it's fair to then apply that question or apply that set of concerns to the film itself, right? Like, you know, I don't think that James Baldwin was, I think that we were talking about like the idea of like what it means to like be proud to be an American. You can 100% be proud of your country and recognize that there are troubles. And James Baldwin himself, you know, expressed that idea. He said that he criticizes America because he loves America so much, right? But as soon as we start talking about race, sometimes it's like we forget that multiple things can be true at once and that multiple ideas can be chewed at one time. And I think that I think it's fair to ask an audience to hold multiple thoughts together.
I think a lot of that, and like me posing those questions, is constantly pushing that issue of intersectionality into the forefront of the conversation, because I come from a background of, I studied anthropology and gender studies in college. That was one of the things that I was deeply fascinated by and was where my key interest was. That was 10 years ago. Intersectionality was not part of that conversation. And I'm constantly asking myself, why, even 10 years ago, was this not part of the conversation? Like, it's once I kind of fell into that area of study and understanding that you can hold identities at the same time, you can hold more than one thought in your head at the same time, you can have complicated feelings about, you know, your identity and how they intersect with others and things that are going around socially in your country and in the area that you're in. That being a new concept, I want to bring that up as much as I can, because it's something that almost, it makes the conversation more complex, but it also kind of clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it allows, it gives that latitude of, it's okay to jump around, it's okay to be confused, we're going to work through this, and it's important that we do, because it's not, and I see the kind of the same fights that you've had, Sherlani, or you've seen, Sherlani, of like, who has priority? There's this like idea of, well, one person has it more worse off than the other, so we should be focusing on the person that has it worse off. That's not the conversation that we ideally want to have. We want to talk about where things are going wrong and how we can learn about them and how we can improve, how we can, you know, reframe things so that our culture is more of a fit for everybody, and it isn't, the power dynamics aren't as wide. I'm kind of wandering around a little bit in this thought, but yeah, it's that question of intersectionality that's really important to me that I just keep bringing up. So
one thing that this series has taught me that I did not expect to be like taught is how is how I now think that like my own identities have affected the way that I curated my own undergraduate experience. Like you guys all at this, you guys who have been in all these discussions know that my undergraduate degree was in history and I focused on American history, but like you take those cognate courses, and Nancy, something that you said made me think about it, but I was like, I am not taking a women's studies class unless it is cross-listed as like African American, and you know what, I can't even remember what the department was, but I was like, I am not taking one of those classes unless it's cross-listed with something else, because I don't want to, because I cannot, because I will just in that class like, but what about like I don't want to be I don't have a contrarian personality, but I know I would have felt that way in some of those classes after being exposed to some of those particular people who I knew were taking those classes in other classes. And so like that is something that I now realize was very much a decision made on, you know, made based on experiences that I had as a student at the university where I was. And I think about that now, right? Because it's like you curated a different path than you know, than other people with your same degree had, and they curated their own paths based on whatever. But this really like illustrates it, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, you can take that.
It also kind of gives me like, you know, the best intentions pave the road to hell, because like I curated my experience in anthropology specifically for that reason, because I wanted different perspectives than what I had. So I didn't take that Women in America writing class. I took the Men in America writing class, figuring, you know, I'm going to get a different perspective for this, and it's going to be, I'm going to have a little bit more holistic of an experience. That course was a crash course in toxic masculinity 101, and it was a nightmare. So, we're like reading The Game and, you know, talking about, you know, just taking Chuck Palahniuk completely the wrong way and taking Fight Club very literally. But no, it's like that. Yeah, you do curate that experience, and I have a lot of regrets of like being young and naive and curating it and not understanding exactly the decisions that I was making. So looking back on that and kind of reevaluating where my bias was and what my understanding of things were that was totally inaccurate or very different from what the reality was. So getting that juxtaposition. So
Rich, you brought up something I would like to revisit, right? So like one thing that the movie did specifically made a choice to do is show where James Baldwin was when he heard about the murders of his very young friends as they happened. And I thought that that was very interesting, but I'm curious about, I would like for you guys to talk about what you thought about that rather than me spitting at you what I thought about it. Rich, you noticed it, so I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, for me, it was, a lot of them were phone calls. Like, so I'm of an age where I remember, I have vivid memories of receiving bad phone calls. Like we had a kid I went to high school with got in a motorcycle accident and died. And it was somebody decided to call everybody and have everybody call everybody. And I remember vividly sitting on the couch and the phone rang. Like I walked over, picked it up. I had some friends over. You get that call and they relate the story of, I think is it James Baldwin's sister? Like they're all hanging out. She takes the phone call, she comes back and she looks, he uses a word that's not like troubled, but she looks something and she barely eats, and the way he describes it, and she doesn't say anything for a while until finally she says something like, I think I should tell you this because the press are on their way. Like the press are coming here to talk to you. And I think that was Malcolm X, I believe. But the way that he describes those moments and having recollection of that so vivid, like I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting all it connects with a bunch of different things, right? And so that's hard. And it's to learn of death of a friend. That is something here in Ann Arbor in the archives when businesses closed for the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. There's a sign that was on one business that said closed for the death of a friend. And like I think about that a little. Like I think about how for real friends and for people who just felt an affinity towards this person who they probably saw on TV or maybe heard in the newspaper or whatever. Yeah, I'm kind of rambling, but it was very affecting.
One thing that stood out to me visually in the movie when they talked about that, because with each of these deaths, he was traveling, right? And then like the images that you saw on the screen, it like shows that he was traveling. It shows that he was living his life, not expecting this thing. And again, like the anvil of racism just fell on his head. Like that is what, by the deaths of these folks. And so I thought that was very interesting and very visually interesting way to like bring that home, right? And then I think that another one of the ideas that this movie plays with or brings up is like, what's American dream, right? And so for some people, like if you look at this James, like you can definitely look at James Baldwin as a self-made man, right? Like he was not somebody who had like this huge pedigree. One of the reasons why that he stated that he was not affiliated with the NAACP, for example, was that he was like, the classism was just too much and I could not even with that, right? And so you have this person who came from the family situation they did, one of many children. It's not, he had an abusive stepfather. There's all this stuff that happened, and he was able to ultimately become like this world famous thinker, right? And he was able to like turn his talents into something that allowed him to some degree of escape, the ability to travel and things like that. And in some ways you would see that as American dream, right? Like if you look at the myth of what the American dream is, like you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you make yourself into the man that you want to be. And so like in one sense he had like achieved this thing, right? This idea, but then just got yanked out of it, time and time again because the social circumstances in his home, which he was essentially in exile from, right, created. And I thought that this movie really kind of framed that up. That's how I took it anyway. But we all have our own experience when we're...
Yeah. It was also kind of I got that feeling from what you were talking about, Rich, because I've gotten news over the phone of, deaths in families and medical conditions and tragedies. And there's almost that out of body experience, hearing about it from another person's perspective. So when 3 years ago, my brother had a stroke and I got the news while I was at work. And I had a coworker talk to me about what they saw my experience was maybe 6 or 8 months after the fact. And it was so surreal to kind of like hear from their perspective. You looked so much more put together than what I actually felt. So kind of hearing in James Baldwin's own words, the devastation that he felt at losing a friend felt so familiar and felt so humanizing in a way, and really kind of drives that point home of, this is just another person. This is for all of his accomplishments and his identity and who he is. It's like there are many things about the human condition that are constant, and it also personalized the deaths of these public figures. there's a big discussion a lot in online communities about parasocial relationships and the relationships that people form with public figures and celebrities and people that create content and media and that they consume on a regular basis, and some of the traps that you can kind of fall in of feeling connected to somebody who you have never met and who will never meet you, and then when you actually meet, and the power dynamic that the power discrepancy that creates, which is very human and at the same time kind of a big hole to fall into. But no, it's from learning one vantage point, one viewpoint of the deaths of people that were so famous and so important in American history, and learning it from a personal perspective, I thought was really powerful.
What you just said, Nancy, about hearing about, I don't know the phrase you used, about like seeing famous people. And
Parasocial relationships.
Parasocial relationships.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
His James Baldwin's story about how he first met Malcolm X, where he's giving he's lecturing, and there's Malcolm X, this guy who it sounded like he had not met in person yet, but he knew about, and how intimidating that was. It was Sherlani, you mentioned some of the visuals that were happening when when the narration was happening about some of these deaths. I couldn't remember what the visuals were, because I know, especially for that dinner scene, all I could picture was the dinner. The way the words were written and the way that the narration worked. He used words like, it was like, I think he said an expensive dinner. Like, he used very specific, such well-crafted words in a notes, like, this is not a final copy. These are notes that he wrote, took me out of the visuals and put me right there in my head about what people might've been wearing. Like, it was it's very powerful writing. I had read Giovanni's Room, and other than that, very little Baldwin. But seen a lot of clips, news clips and things, just spectacular writing, and just the way it worked with the narration was great.
Just to jump in really quickly with some pedantry, because that, like, those accounts actually they're from his book No Name in the Street. And I think so. It's like he has like his kind of like nonfiction collections, and No Name in the Street is really where he's dealing with a lot of that stuff about those 3 assassinations. And then I think like Remember This House was going to be a continuation of that, and he was just never able to finish it. But that is a really, I really recommend reading it. It's a really heavy book, but it's really good.
Sorry guys, I was just looking at these notes. So Rich, I'm going to talk about that moment that you're talking about. So one thing that stood out to me when he was talking about meeting Malcolm X for the first time was that he was like, I didn't necessarily have a reason to trust this dude. He didn't necessarily have a reason to trust me. Like, that is something that just I was like, that feels right? Because like, I think that's one way that this film, I think that one of the things that this film does that's interesting, but it does it very softly and very like under the surface, is it communicates that these figures, their thoughts move, right? Because we saw that this is stated, right? Like how people's views seemed to be very far from each other, and then over time converged, right? And then I think that sometimes when we, when we look at the like progress narrative that we're often taught with respect to American history, like we want to kind of put people like, okay, this is where you fit on that progress timeline, right? Here's the good one, here's the bad one, right? And James Baldwin this movie talks about that idea as well. But I think like this moment of sizing up talks about something important as well, right? Because like when you're trying to do this work, right, where you're trying to move the culture, when you're trying to move the society, when you are trying to make change, you constantly have to be assessing, you know, everybody around you, right? Because like people are either going to be like with you or not with you in some senses, or like you have to figure out like where you overlap and where you don't. And so like to have to do that while you're delivering a speech, one, is just unimaginable. But two, I thought it was an important moment to be captured, right? Like these people had to figure out what their relationships to each other were, right? There was a quote in this movie that I thought was interesting, and I was just wondering how people responded to this one. At one point, Baldwin says, "I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built this country." That stick, like I felt when I read that, all I could think about was the 1619 Project, right? Because that is, I feel like that's one of the arguments that project makes, right? And right now there's like this push and pull about like the very existence of a collection of work that seeks to acknowledge the contributions that Black Americans have made to the United States. So that felt so, for me, when I heard that, it felt super contemporary. It felt like this could have come out of that collection of essays to me.
I got the feeling from the film over and over again of it just kept repeating in my head, Baldwin was ahead of his time. And I hate that phrase because it almost it almost takes the agency out of the person of like saying that, you know, they were ahead of their time and not a product of their time. That, you know, there's some kind of association in my head of, if you say somebody's ahead of their time, it takes them out of the environment that they're in and devalues the experiences that they've had in a way for me. So that quote and a lot of the things that I've read of his that feel like they could have been written in our time. I don't know where I was going with that, but it just there's a struggle in my head between that I'm having a little bit of trouble identifying. But
I think the other side of that coin, I mean, tell me if you disagree, because this is not something that, maybe I'm the only one who thinks that, but the following. But I think that a question that comes up, like when we think about like how contemporary those words feel, is like, why are we still here, right? Like here is this person who was like, he was a prolific writer. He was like, you know, during certain points in his career, like he was the one who people were like, this is the good one. He's the one that's not racist. He is the, you know what I mean? Like he was in some circles like the darling, right? Like his words went all over the place, right? Like this is not somebody who like wrote a bunch of stuff and never got a platform. This is somebody who absolutely had a platform. And this is somebody, as I keep saying, like we keep knocking on his door, and yet, like decade after decade, we keep coming back because the words still feel very contemporary. And I think that raises questions of like, why, right? Like what are the systems in place that help maintain certain circumstances, you know, because it doesn't seem, if you've got a really strong structure, it's not because it was accidentally built.
Right. And thank you for saying that, because it just brings up yeah, I definitely agree. I'm asking that question to myself now of why, and like that, for that strong of a, like you said, that strong of a structure to be built and his writings to be that strong that we're still referring back to them 30, 40 years later. How did that happen? Like, how are we still having this conversation? How is this not taken? If it was so strong then. Why have we not implemented it? Why have we not moved forward with it? So
I wonder where the media falls in, right? Because
yeah,
of the way that this film went, like this film specifically made us think about like what were then mainstream images that like people took for granted, right? And then there are certain things that Baldwin said at one point that I was like, yeah, there's a point there, but like when you're consuming media, right? Like you are meant to identify with whoever the protagonist is, right? You know, when he was talking about the Western movies, he's like, you know, you know, he's like, as a boy, I'm looking at John Wayne, and I'm like pulling for John Wayne, not realizing that I am actually the other guy in this film, right? And then, you know, again, as a result of this series, I find myself thinking about that a lot with like police procedurals, which are super popular, and even like crime podcasts, which are like super popular. And like when I think about like how much consumption of these kinds of media occur and who we are meant to identify with, and like what does that do to the way that we are thinking about the way that we're framing other people or ourselves even. And how does that all stack up?
and I mean, that's even bringing up thoughts for me of like what kind of cartoons are created and what media and stuff for kids is created, and the kinds of unintentional messages that are sent and unintentional dynamics that are put forward. So like Paw Patrol is a big one that comes up in conversation a lot lately of like it's a kid's version of a police procedural. So it's kind of having that, from what I know of it, it's kind of having that same conversation of like, who are you expected to identify with? How is this written, and how is it presented, and who is the focus on? What are the roles that are assigned in that media?
Talking about media, talking about representation, it brings back that towards the beginning of the film where he is like, I went to the movies and I saw Joan Crawford do a cool little dance and a cute little outfit, and I thought to myself, white women can't be all that bad. She looks so cool. She looks amazing. And that opened the door into him being able to have a relationship with that particular teacher. And that relationship with that particular teacher allowed him to say, you know, I can't hate white people because they're not, it's all not one thing. Going through that journey of how he began to perceive white people, I only say it to underline the things that you guys have just said, that the importance of media, the importance of representation, it's almost, I cannot say enough the role it plays in our lives.
Well, and to continue your thought, like when think about the fact that like most of us still like operate our lives in segregated spaces, right? And so that also underlines the influence that like the media may have, right? Like if you don't, you know, because you touched on that, like he, you know, he felt like he knew this white woman because he's, you know, he saw her, right? And then he had this teacher who he knew. But what happens when you don't know anyone, right? And then what happens when every single image that you see, or many of the images that you see, you know, are telling you who these people who you don't know are, right? And then we are all, you know, susceptible to fears, right? Like we're all afraid of something, right? And so like
And it's the base fear in the human mind of the unknown and the other, because that psychologically, that one concept of the tribal nature and the otherness of people is, it's not adaptability, crap, what's the word? It's a survival skill, and this is how human beings survived from, you know, and evolved, were these survival skills and that concept of otherness. And that's I can watch, and we were asking like, how is this conversation still continuing? I really think it's that operating in segregated spaces. That's a building block of why people don't, and why different races don't understand each other, why racism is still a huge issue in American culture, is that there's no overlap. I see it in my own family. People that I love and care about have never had an experience with someone of a different race in their entire lives. And then the first experience they have, everything that they've experienced before that in the media and in news, and that fear and that otherness that they've been cultivated, that they've been taught, colors that experience and then informs that entire experience. And it's so spooky to watch that. But like, that concept of otherness is very key to human survival, and it's very hard to overcome.
I think
Not impossible though, but
I think that sometimes even with this, like the idea of holding multiple thoughts in one's head comes in again, right? Because like a lot of times if you're living, I think that some people probably have like zero interaction, but a lot of times there are people who have little interaction, little social interaction with people from other groups, but like but you're totally interacting with people in positions of service, right? And so what does it mean to integrate, like, what does it mean to hold two thoughts in your head, right? Like because a lot of people, for example, in healthcare situations, like nurses and things like that, a lot of those people are like people of color, right? And like, what does it mean that in one moment you totally think that the person is competent to take your blood and do this and do that, but then like somewhere else you think the person is just like not competent of doing anything at all? Like, how do we create those situations? Or the one that my favorite example of this, right, is like in some of these situations that go viral now, like you hear somebody like after the poor moment that makes them look bad has gone viral, they're like talking about like, oh my gosh, I was afraid of this person. But it's like, were you though, when you went and picked that conflict? Like these two, like how do these two ideas, like what are we doing in our minds around race that's allowing us to like just accept these like blatant conflicts sometimes, like,
or to even like push yourself into a conflict that doesn't need to happen.
Yeah, that's what
like that kind of social policing that that's not necessary. Like that's always confused me. I'm sorry, that thought came out of nowhere, but like, yeah, that those conflicts to me, from my perspective, are totally avoidable, but we see them so much.
Well, I think that we're talking about like this timelessness that Baldwin has. And usually when we talk about timelessness, right, it's a very positive thing. It's like, oh, like Shakespeare's works are so timeless, like they're so relevant to us hundreds of years later. And and then we're just like, but why are James Baldwin's works timeless? Like, shouldn't we be over this stuff by now? Shouldn't we have changed the laws and the policies and gotten beyond this? But what you guys are talking about was just like the way that prejudice works. And like, I think Baldwin, just because of his class background and his sexuality and his race, like all together, just had like this like amazingly fine-tuned understanding of how prejudice works and like why people are prejudiced and like why prejudice like scrambles our brains, like in the way that you're talking about, Shalanya. And like, I like,
I mean, like so many other ways too. Like even with, like one thing that we don't talk about when we talk about writers a lot is like, even especially male writers, we do not talk about like the beauty standard, right? And if you look at like what American beauty standard looks like, Baldwin is particularly situated, right? Like he's a very dark-skinned man, he has a particular like features that are very associated with African features, right? Which in our society are situated a certain way. He knew that, you know what I mean? And so like there's so many ways. Like do we have a James Baldwin? And maybe we do, but do we have a James Baldwin if James Baldwin looks like Harry Belafonte, right? Maybe we do, but maybe we don't, right? And that's a thing that we don't often talk about. I mean, we have a Harry Belafonte, you know, and he looks like Harry Belafonte, but you know, that's a question that I find myself thinking about sometimes. But I do think that his many layers, right, put him in a spot where he's like, I see that. And I think he can tell the difference between the different things, right? Like, I think that there's a real tendency to throw things that are related to each other in the same box, but they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily the same thing, right? And I think he's like, nope, this is what this one is. And then he has this clarity of vision that he's able to put words to that like just really brings the reader into exactly what he's talking about, because he is very precise and his words often do double time, right? Like he's telling you a big thing and he's telling you a smaller thing and he's telling you some sub things in that semicolon sentence that he has written us.
I think one place where he, what you're saying, Sherlanya, where he like gets that pin in there when he's talking about Bobby Kennedy is saying, you know, maybe in like 40 years we can even have a Black president, and you would hear that and be like, yay us, we can do this, we can have a Black president. And James Baldwin is like, excuse me, actually we've been here for 400 years and you have been here for a very short time and you got to be president right away. Like he takes something that he's so good at because he comes from all those different viewpoints of finding the very truth about all these little moments. But that was one for me that just really stuck out, that needed to be pointed out. It's not necessarily obvious, but it's like, wait, yeah, this guy his family got here not that long ago, and look what the Kennedys have done. Who's he to tell me when I get to be something when I've been here all along? So
I find that bravery to be, I cannot fathom what might go on. I mean, they used to call James Baldwin and be like, hey, we got a racist, we're going to put him on national TV. Will you come on and argue with him live on national television? And for him to be so well spoken and not calm, but there's a centeredness, a huge responsibility was shoved upon him, and he met the challenge and exceeded the challenge. And you see that just in the ways that he uses language. There's the big thing, little thing subtext. It's astounding. And why do we keep on knocking on James Baldwin's door? It's because he said it real good. I'm just, it's just like unimaginable, the pressure and weight that must have been on his shoulders.
One of my like favorite like images from the movie, just what you're talking about, Jacob, and just like, right, the way that he gets put in these impossible situations and he just comes out. So when they have this footage, I think it's like from a 1968 debate with William F. Buckley, who's like this conservative commentator, and he just mops the floor with Buckley, right? Yeah. And you see this guy who's like the head of this like Cambridge debating society in his stupid 19th century outfit and his like big old like cravat bow tie thing, like looking totally ridiculous. And he's like standing up and there are like tears in his eyes. And, you know, he's just like leading everybody in the standing ovation. That moment, it was just like so absurd, but it's like, wow, that is the power of Baldwin.
Amazing.
So is there anything that we did not touch on that somebody was like, oh, I cannot wait until the question about X happens because I'm going in?
Yes.
I like montage of everyone looking off in the distance. But Jacob, you said yes. So go.
Are you sitting here lying like, no, there's nothing on my mind. There's nothing. We've kind of already talked about this, but the experience when, and he described about how he went to that movie about the janitor and how the janitor who was falsely accused and how the janitor wasn't even a big role in that movie. That was the my big gut punch, because not only does media tell us who other people are, it tells us who we are. And to be put in a place where I had to consider what it was like for James Baldwin to watch this film about this man being falsely accused, and I can only imagine the terror that he must have experienced, realizing that he could have been in that same position, or could be in the future as well. And I guess that just speaks to perhaps the amount of bravery that I feel that James Baldwin has, and just to live in some sort of existential terror crisis that's repeatedly shown to you on TV and movies and books. So yeah, it's the type of thing I have a lot of stuff to say about that janitor movie, but nothing in particular. I should have just shut up.
No, I think that was a good that's a good point that movie like specifically chose, right? Like that, like seeing that fear, recognizing that fear, and realizing that that's something that could happen, right? Because like that's one of the things that's like you know, you see it on Twitter, and I imagine other places as well, right? Like when people are collectively experiencing, seeing, you know, people being killed in real time or close to real time, right? Say by like with I remember seeing this in particular around Breonna Taylor's killing, right? And seeing a lot of people just feeling like she was at home in her house, in her bed, and she was not safe. That means that there is nowhere that I am safe, right? And so I definitely think that that's a relevant portion to pluck out. So no striking that from the record.
So I don't know how to have this conversation exactly, but I think something that struck me was there was the clip of, I believe it was like appearing now in this panel is Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and each of them are Malcolm X calls MLK an Uncle Tom and gets into this whole thing about nonviolence, and then MLK responds, and having an idea at this particular point that this was how all of these important people in the civil rights movement felt, and that they had different views, and they had to come together, and they had clash about how this should be done and everything else. And it made me think about the relationships between all of these people, all these men mostly, trying to work together to change something big. And then that made me think about like more I have a point here, more modernly, like today with the NBA. So the NBA bubble, and the players, they just refused to play. There was another Black man killed by police. They refused to play, and then all the NBA players had to decide what to do. Like, do we continue to hold out and not play? Do we concede for some things? The younger players wanted something than some of the older players did. LeBron James called Barack Obama and got his advice about what he thought they should do. And thinking about factions and things, and then reading or hearing about like, this is hard to talk about. This is this is a huge problem that's been here for centuries, and it keeps being thrust upon the Black community to solve it. And it's not like this is entrenched. Like the owners of most of the NBA teams are white, like billionaires, some of them. What are they going to do about it? Like, I kept thinking about the factions of the civil rights leaders trying to work together to make this impossible thing happen, holy cow, that's like to have all that division and then try and break this impossible centuries long entrenched thing. I don't know. I don't really have a point. Like it made me think about all of this. Like, why has this been going on so long? Because it's next to impossible because of the power, like just the inherent power that I don't know, white America has. What does he say? White is Baldwin says something like white is synonymous for power.
Metaphor for power.
Yeah, like, but the onus keeps being put upon the Black community to solve this. You tell us what to do. Like, Black community, tell us how to, and it's like, I don't know. I'm just some 40-year-old Canadian. I'm like, I don't know how, yeah.
I picked up on two things you said, Rich, and it kind of kicked off a thought for me of, I loved that the film showed the juxtaposition between, especially MLK and Malcolm X's opinions and their solutions for the civil rights movement. It's really easy to look back on history with kind of a singular lens of, this was, that kind of like history is written by the victors kind of thing of like, there's always going to be differing opinions of how a problem should be solved. And there's always going to be, camps of people against one another and compromises that need to be made and discussions of like how you come together to solve a problem. But you're absolutely right that racism in America is this hugely entrenched problem that you're asking just these two men to solve. That's what history is framed it as, of like it was up to them to solve this. When I agree with you, the pressure was on the Black and it still is on the Black community to solve this and explain it to white people of why things have gone wrong and what needs to change, when it's not up to one group of people. That's an absolute, I think that's why things haven't changed as much as like a progression through history would hope it had been changed, because there's not enough acceptance of responsibility of everyone. I wouldn't say that for a lot of issues, especially stuff of like climate change when you're talking about like giant corporations and things like that. But with this issue specifically, it is on everyone to ask themselves the questions, to have the conversations, and to try to figure out ways to encourage these white billionaires that own these all Black sports teams to actually do something instead of just, thoughts and prayers. It's going to be great. Like, or a media stunt or something. That's a way more complicated of a push to get things to change. So
I feel like also to speak to what Nancy and Rich are both saying, that this is something that Baldwin even addresses when he kind of is saying like it's not the problem of the oppressed people to fix their oppression. It is the oppressors have to figure out why they need us to be oppressed, like why they need that to happen. And until they figure that out, nothing's going to change. That's definitely not the way he said it, but I think that's sort of what you guys are both kind of getting at, and I feel like that's reflected in this film and in other things that Baldwin wrote as well.
There's one particular, sorry.
No, go.
There's one particular quote in the movie which I had actually written down, which I think is what you guys are talking about. James Baldwin says, "You never had to look at me, I had to look at you. I know more about you than you know about me. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced."
Rich, I think that part of I think that one thing that I think is pretty important to point out about like the idea that you're bringing up, right? Like when you're talking about like different people, essentially using the tools that are available to them in order to make change, right? That's what you're talking about when you're talking about the NBA players. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the people that you mentioned using the platforms that they had. But I think that one thing that it's important to point out, and actually I think that this is tied to other statements, is that Black people have always been coming up with solutions to this problem. Like, it is not true that that Black people have not been working on this problem, right? Like if you have resistance, if you have a slave rebellion, that is Black people responding to and looking for a solution to this problem, right? And like when we look at history, sometimes we look for speeches and we look for all sorts of things, but like Black people have always been putting that work in, and it's not necessarily being put in for anybody else's benefit. It's just like, hey, this is a problem, and part of my life is to resist and to work on this problem. And I think that sometimes that gets, a little bit clouded over, right? Just because it's, and I'm not saying like, Rich, I think you clouded over this. That is not what I'm saying. But I do think that you reminded me of the resistance that takes place, and that it takes place in many forms, big and small, right? Like when you figure out a way to have like all of the jobs to make sure that your child gets the education that your child has systematically been removed from, that's resistance, right? Like when you are sacrificing your own hungry belly to make sure that in your circumstance that your child is getting like what they need, that's resistance. You know what I mean? That's like you making specific choices in order to have a positive outcome as possible inside of an oppressive system. Every one of those decisions is resistance. And sometimes it looks like saying, your system sucks, and like, I'm not participating in that. Like, that is one way. And then another way is to like try to work inside of that system. But it's all resistance, even though like we may pitch it differently and frame it differently if we try to apply a term like the civil rights movement to it. But like all of that work, just like there are a million things that hold a system together, there are a million ways that people are resisting that system day by day, I guess. Any closing thoughts? We have like overshot the the hour, so we probably should wrap it up.
Thank you for hosting this discussion, Sherlania. It was really enjoyable. That was really enlightening, and
thanks to all of you for being here. It's not always it's a challenge to have conversations like this when you know that they're being recorded, and I 100% respect all of you for being willing to participate in that. So thank you so much.